Hey guys, I'm Ted and I'm here to give you another lecture, and for this lecture we're going to continue our discussion on the Transcontinental Railway. Now in our last lecture we discussed how the railway was impacting all segments of the economy, leading to the rise of the forestry industry in North Carolina, Wisconsin, and Michigan, but how it also affected the steel industry, helping Birmingham to become a major steel producer while also allowing Carnegie to expand his operations. We also discussed how the early locomotives, how the early locomotives were transported across the Missouri River, and with there we'll pick right back up off with the problems confronting the project supervisors, those who were in charge of overseeing the construction of the railway. And with that, we'll jump into the problem that they had to address fairly early on, and that is feeding the workmen. Now, feeding the work crews became another issue that had to be dealt with. Had the work crews pushed further out into the plains, it became much more difficult to adequately provide for them. One solution to this was to hire hunters to kill the buffalo, then prevalent on the Great Plains, to feed the workmen. Now, one of William Cody's early jobs was to go out and hunt buffalo and bring them back, and bring back the meat, from the buffalo carcass to feed the workmen. And this helped William Cody earn his nickname Buffalo Bill. Taking herds of cattle along was also a solution to feeding the workmen. Now the cattle could be taken and slaughtered along the way to feed the men. Native resistance was another problem that affected the completion of the railway. The Great Plains, of course, was the ancestral home to a number of Native American peoples. Now, the surveyors were the biggest targets, and these surveyors were typically sent out in small teams to stake out the path of the rail tracks. Native Americans scouting these bands would simply follow them and tear out the stakes when they came across them. And on occasion, they even attacked scouting parties whenever it suited them. Now, the Cheyenne were very adept at targeting surveyors in particular, and the Sioux even at one point tried to stop a locomotive by stretching a rawhide rope across the rail tracks. The Sioux, of course, were familiar with the idea or the concept that a rope could stop a man on horseback, but they were unable to conceptualize the difference in terms of power between a horse and a locomotive. Now, as the workmen progressed and extended the tracks, the entire work camp followed. Typically, this was done every week or so. Every week and a half, the camp would move to the end of the tracks, along with the menagerie of characters that were hanging on to them. The gamblers, the brothels keepers, the barkeepers, all of the characters that you would associate with this large movement of people. Now, the Central Pacific faced perhaps the worst difficulties. They had the very daunting and the very challenging task of laying track through the Sierra Nevada mountains. Now, the majority of the workers for the Central Pacific Railway were Chinese immigrants. They were hired by Leland Stanford, who was one of the principal owners of the Central Pacific. Now, the engineering for the tracks had become very intricate because locomotives, as stated earlier, cannot climb steep gradients. So to lay their tracks, the crews had to lay a lot of curved tracks and and they had to cut a lot of embankments. Now, the crews had to clear off sections of redwood by cutting them down and blasting out the stumps because they were so large. Worst of all for the crews was construction of summit tunnels, and they had to construct these summit tunnels through granite. Now, most of this work was done by hammer and chisel, And the technique known for cutting out the tunnels is known as double jacking, and that is one man would hold the chisel while the other would swing the sledgehammer. And you have to imagine it's a very frightening prospect. New guy on the job, or even a veteran guy on the job, you have to hold the chisel in place while somebody else just swings a sledgehammer with all their weight behind it. And you would do this repeatedly. You with the chisel holder moving the chisel little by little until a little hole is made. And when enough of these holes were made, they would be packed with blasting powder. And this was a very dangerous practice, because sometimes the distance the men retreated to were not safe enough, and they would be hit with the blowback from the walls. Now, needless to say, there was a very high death rate amongst the Chinese crewmen. This was before the invention of dynamite, which is a much more effective explosive. During this time, nitroglycerin was used, but nitroglycerin is a very volatile, very unstable liquid. Glycerin, is noted for its instability, and it is known to go off when the temperature gets too high. It is very unstable, very volatile, very dangerous. Now, the Sierra Nevadas receive a tremendous amount of snowfall every year. During the construction of the rail lines through the mountains, it was not uncommon for Chinese workmen living to have their living quarters be completely inundated with snow, forcing the workers to carve tunnels through the snow from their work camps through the snow to get to work. The volatile surface areas were also known to give way, causing horses to fall through sheets of ice, horses and men to fall through sheets of ice, and they'd both be lacerated by this very sharp glass-like ice. Sometimes the lacerations would be cut through, and sometimes they'd get cut down to the bone. Through it all, the workmen persisted, and the work done in laying the tracks through Sierra Nevada represents one of the greatest engineering accomplishments in the United States history. Now, another engineering feat undertaken out of necessity was the building of snow sheds. Snow sheds were necessary in areas of high snowfall, the areas where avalanches were most common. Now, snow sheds were heavy timber sheds that were built over the tracks to keep the tracks free from debris, that is snow and whatnot. Now, there were hazards with this, as the shed could not be too long, or the operator, the train conductor, would asphyxiate on the fumes. Now, the gaps between the snow sheds needed large numbers of workmen to keep these spaces clear. The snow sheds were a continuing source of irritation for the rail lines. The snow sheds rotted, of course, in wet weather, and they will become very dry in the heat, and they will become fire hazards. They obscured the view of passengers, but they were essential. They were essential to the upkeep and maintenance and the continuance of the rail line. Trestle bridges were also built, and they were built to carry locomotives across the ravines and the mountain sides. The first bridges, of course, were made of wood, and of course they rotted, they decayed and fell away, and there were also potential fire hazards, much like the snow shed, which necessitated their replacement with metal bridges later on. Now, the initial work was very difficult, and the mountain was problematic. The mountain atmosphere were problematic, and all of them, the bridges and the snow sheds, it was very problematic and very labor intensive to maintain. Now, once the tracks had been laid through the mountains, the workmen were confronted by another formidable opponent, the Nevada desert. The original locomotives were steam powered, which meant that great quantities of water had to be procured and maintained. The railroad companies had to build immense canals at first to channel water from the mountains down to the tracks. Now, this led to water tanks becoming a standard feature at railroad stops. Now, the desert was flat land, and that eased the burden greatly on the workmen and the engineers. Indeed, once leaving, they found that once they got out of the Sierra Nevadas, they encountered a 172-mile stretch where there were no geographical changes, just flat land ready for them to go. Now, the two rail lines met just north of Salt Lake City at Promontory Point, Utah, on May 10th, 1869, with Leland Stanford completing the line by driving in the last spike, a golden rail spike at that. And that completed the Great Railway. And this railway bisected the entire republic. It was needless to say that travel became something of ease. The time was cut dramatically. As noted, prior to the completion of the Transcontinental Railway, the only way to travel across the country and get to the western states by land was by the many western trails, namely the Oregon Trail. And travel by these trails could take 3 months. In good weather, in perfect conditions, it could take 3 months, and that was and if things went bad, you didn't. It was really indeterminate. You could not really determine when you would make it to the west if conditions were bad. Now with the completion of the Transcontinental Railway, travel time took less than a week, and time for further diminished had geographical improvements were made. Now, one such improvement was the inclusion of telegraphs along the track. Telegraphs allowed Morse code messages to be sent alerting trains of the location of other trains, and this helped to avoid head-on collisions from taking place. Now, George Westinghouse, an early competitor to Thomas Edison, who we discussed in 2 lectures back on Great Industrialists, Westinghouse made one of the great safety improvements to the rail line and really to all automotive travel. He invented the air brake. Now, modern trains characteristically have dozens of train cars. Early train cars only carried a few. This was because only the locomotive had brakes, and after the locomotive put the brakes on, the inertia of the following cars would push it along for a distance. With Westinghouse's invention, it became possible for every car to slow down simultaneously. Now, this was great for safety, but also allowed the train to be larger and longer as well. Snowfall was also a great problem for the early railways. Has noted a lot of the areas where they had to go through were mountainous and received a lot of intense snowfall. Intense snowfall was known to block the line for weeks, and this was really a detriment to the settlements along the rail route. These settlements would often depend on the rail lines, so the timely arrival of these rail lines and their trains for vital necessities. The early rail lines simply carried shovels, and when they encountered difficulties relating to snow, they would simply stop the train and ask all of the men on board to get out and shovel the snow out of the way. And this plan was not well suited for the Nevada plains, where the snowstorms are quite intense. So a new plan was needed. And for that new plan, we'll discuss the new plan in our next lecture. We'll break here. And as always, hit like, subscribe, and comment. And let me know what you think about this lecture. Let me know what you think about the Transcontinental Railway and what we discussed so far. And as always, I'm Ted, and I'll see you guys next time.